The clinking of my brother, Richard's, champagne flute against his water glass, a sound designed to command attention, cut through the polite murmur of my 40th birthday dinner. He rose from his chair at the head of the long, polished table in the private dining room of one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, a smug, almost triumphant smile playing on his lips. My name is Thomas Albright, and until that precise moment, I had considered myself a reasonably fortunate, if somewhat unassuming man. I am a senior partner at a successful architectural firm, a profession that demands a meticulous attention to detail, a deep understanding of structural integrity, and an ability to see the unseen forces that can, if not properly accounted for, bring even the most magnificent edifice crashing down. Richard cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over the assembled guests, my closest friends, my business partners, my fiancé, the beautiful and vivacious Cassandra, seated beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. Friends, family, Richard began, his voice imbued with a theatrical gravitas that always set my teeth on edge. We are here tonight to celebrate my dear older brother, Thomas, on the occasion of his 40th birthday. 40 years, a significant milestone, a time for reflection, for taking stock, and sometimes a time for new beginnings. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, a predatory glint in his eye that I had seen before, usually just before he was about to close a particularly ruthless business deal. Cassandra's hand, I noticed, tightened almost imperceptibly on my arm. A small anomaly, a data point I would, in the cold, clear light of hindsight, come to recognize as a critical system warning. And speaking of new beginnings, Richard continued, his gaze now fixed on me, his smile widening into something that was less fraternal affection and more a shark's baring of teeth. I believe there is another new beginning we should be celebrating tonight. One that involves my dear brother and my own, very special colleague, Cassandra. He then turned to Cassandra, his smile now intimate, possessive. Isn't that right, my love? The silence that descended upon the room was absolute, profound. My mind, trained to analyze structural stress points, registered a catastrophic failure in the foundations of my own life. Richard, my own brother, and Cassandra, my fiancée, the woman I was due to marry in less than 6 months. The two of them, together. The implication of his words, of his intimate address to her, of the sudden, guilty flush that spread across Cassandra's beautiful, treacherous face, was unmistakable. I looked at her. She wouldn't meet my eyes, her gaze fixed on the pristine white linen of the tablecloth. The anomalies of the past few months, the ones I had so foolishly, so willfully ignored, now clicked into place with a sickening, horrifying clarity. The late nights working on a project together that Richard and Cassandra had so often mentioned. The shared, knowing glances I had mistaken for professional camaraderie. The sudden, uncharacteristic coolness in Cassandra's demeanor towards me. A coolness I had attributed to pre-wedding stress. It hadn't been stress. It had been guilt, or perhaps just the inconvenience of maintaining a charade. My friends, my partners stared, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and dawning, horrified comprehension. Richard, it seemed, had chosen my 40th birthday, in front of everyone I held dear, to not just announce his affair with my fiancée, but to do so with a theatrical cruelty, a public display of dominance and betrayal that was breathtaking in its sheer, unadulterated malice. What Richard, in his arrogant, triumphant certainty, did not know, what he and indeed Cassandra had so profoundly underestimated, was that I, the quiet, unassuming architect, the man they had both clearly dismissed as a passive, unobservant obstacle in the path of their grand passion, had my own structural reinforcements in place. For several months, ever since a nagging, intuitive sense that something was deeply amiss had begun to trouble the orderly calm of my life, I had, with the help of my discreet and highly efficient solicitor, Alistair Finch, been engaged in my own quiet, due diligence investigation into my brother's rather creative business practices. Richard's accounting firm, which he had inherited from our late father, was, I had discovered, not the bastion of fiscal probity he so proudly projected. It was, in fact, a house of cards, a complex edifice of over-leveraged assets, questionable tax shelters, and a series of rather irregular transactions involving a number of offshore shell corporations. The dossier I had compiled, a meticulous architectural blueprint of my brother's financial and ethical failings, was currently residing in a secure, encrypted file on my personal server. A dossier that, if delivered to the relevant financial authorities, would not just end Richard's career. It would likely result in a lengthy and deeply unpleasant period of enforced government hospitality for him. I slowly, deliberately placed my napkin on the table. I rose to my feet, my movements calm, measured. I looked at my brother, at his smug, triumphant face. I looked at Cassandra, her head now bowed in a performative display of shame. And then I addressed the stunned, silent room. "Richard," I began, my voice quiet but carrying a new, hard-edged authority that none of them had ever heard from me before. "Thank you for your announcement, and for this rather public clarification of your and Cassandra's true character. You are right. 40 is indeed a time for new beginnings." I then reached into my inside jacket pocket and withdrew not a handkerchief, not a weapon, but a simple, elegant fountain pen, a gift from my late father, and a single, folded sheet of paper. "In my new beginning," I continued, my gaze now locked on Richard's, a cold, humorless smile touching my lips, "starts with a rather significant restructuring of our shared family assets, particularly the ones held in the Albright Family Trust, a trust for which, as you may have forgotten in your romantic distractions, I am the primary, and in certain circumstances, sole discretionary, trustee." The color began to drain from Richard's face. The foundations of his triumph were beginning to look decidedly unstable. The quiet architect was about to demonstrate that he, too, understood the art of a hostile takeover. And his own blueprint for this particular demolition was far more comprehensive and far more devastating than Richard could ever have imagined. The story of my brother Richard's and my fiancée Cassandra's betrayal was not, I later realized, a sudden, unforeseen structural failure, but a slow, insidious process of corrosion, a series of small, almost imperceptible cracks that I, in my trusting, preoccupied state, had failed to properly assess. Richard and I had always been a study in contrasts. I was the elder, the quiet, studious one, drawn to the logic and precision of architecture, to the satisfaction of building things that were both beautiful and enduring. Richard was the charmer, the salesman, the one who had inherited our father's ambition, but none of his quiet, underlying integrity. He had taken over our father's successful accounting firm, not because he had a passion for numbers, but because he had a passion for the status and wealth that came with it. Cassandra had entered my life like a whirlwind, a vibrant, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious junior associate at a rival architectural firm. I had been captivated by her energy, her passion for design, her seemingly genuine admiration for my work. We had been together for 3 years, engaged for 6 months. Our life a seemingly perfect blueprint of shared professional and personal ambitions. The affair, I now understood, had likely begun under the guise of professional collaboration. Richard's firm handled the accounts for a major property developer with whom my own firm often worked. Cassandra, eager to make her mark, had volunteered to be the liaison on a large, complex project. There had been late-night meetings, strategy sessions, business dinners, all of which at the time had seemed perfectly plausible, entirely professional. I had encouraged it, in fact, proud of Cassandra's drive, pleased that she was forming a good working relationship with my brother. The naivete of it, in retrospect, was almost laughable. The first faint tremor that something was amiss had come about 8 months ago. I had been reviewing the preliminary plans for a new commercial tower we were designing, a project that involved a complex and rather innovative approach to foundation engineering. I had mentioned some of the challenges to Richard over a casual family dinner, explaining the intricate calculations required to ensure the building's stability on a particularly difficult geological site. He had listened with his usual polite but clearly feigned interest, his eyes glazing over. The next day, however, I received an email from one of the junior partners of my firm, a man named Gerald, who was also working on the project. Tom, the email read, had a strange call this morning from a rival firm, Sterling and Vance. They seem to have an unusually detailed knowledge of our proprietary foundation design for the downtown tower project. Asked some very pointed questions. Seemed to be trying to poach the client. Any idea how they might have gotten access to such specific and confidential information? My blood had run cold. Sterling and Vance was a notoriously aggressive and ethically questionable competitor. A leak of that magnitude was a serious breach of professional trust and potentially a catastrophic financial blow to my firm. I had launched a discreet internal investigation, but had found no evidence of a data breach, no sign of any of my team members having been compromised. The source of the leak remained a mystery, a deeply unsettling anomaly. But the project had moved forward, the client had remained with us, and the mystery, in the press of other deadlines, had been filed away, an unresolved but seemingly contained issue. Then had come a matter of the Albright Family Trust. It was a substantial entity established by our grandfather, its assets intended to be shared equally between Richard and me, and eventually our own children. I, as the elder son and a man my grandfather had always trusted for my steady, conservative judgment, had been named the primary trustee, with certain discretionary powers to be exercised in the event of one of the beneficiaries acting in a manner detrimental to the long-term health of the trust itself. Richard had always resented my role as trustee, seeing it as another example of our father's and grandfather's perceived favoritism towards me, another check on his own more adventurous financial ambitions. About 6 months ago, he had begun to agitate for a restructuring of the trust, a move to liquidate some of its more conservative long-term holdings and reinvest them in a series of high-yield, fast-growth property ventures he was promoting. Ventures that, upon my own quiet due diligence, had all the hallmarks of a classic and highly risky real estate bubble. I had, of course, refused, citing my fiduciary duty to preserve the long-term value of the trust, a decision that had led to a series of increasingly acrimonious arguments between us. It was during this period that my own, more personal suspicions about Richard and Cassandra had begun to surface. Their late-night project meetings had become more frequent, their shared, knowing glances across the dinner table more pronounced. Cassandra's own behavior towards me had become a strange mixture of feigned affection and a new, almost dismissive impatience. The pieces were all there, a series of seemingly disconnected data points, a collection of subtle structural stresses. But I had refused, or perhaps been unable, to see the larger pattern, to acknowledge the horrifying truth they pointed to, that my brother and my fiancé were not just engaged in a tawdry affair, but were likely conspiring against me on a professional and financial level as well. The leak of my firm's proprietary foundation design, Richard's desperate push to gain control of the family trust, Cassandra's increasing detachment, it was all part of the same, sordid, interconnected web of betrayal. My birthday dinner, Richard's cruel, public announcement, had not been a spontaneous act of passion. It had been a calculated power play, an attempt to emotionally demolish me, to shatter my confidence, to make me more pliable, more vulnerable, in the face of their impending, two-fronted assault on my personal and financial life. They had intended my 40th birthday to be the beginning of my end. They had no idea it was about to become the beginning of theirs. The dossier on Richard's questionable business practices, the one I had quietly begun to compile after the foundation design leak, with the help of a discreet forensic accountant named Eleanor Sterling, was now my primary weapon. It detailed a pattern of financial mismanagement, of potential fraud, of a business empire built on a foundation as unstable as the geological site of my downtown tower project. It was my own proprietary design, a blueprint for his complete and utter ruin. And I, the quiet architect, the man they had so grievously underestimated, was about to present it, not for review, but for immediate and catastrophic implementation. The new beginning Richard had so smugly toasted was indeed at hand. But the foundations of that new beginning were about to be shaken to their very core. The stunned silence that followed my quiet, but deeply resonant, pronouncement about the Albright family trust was broken by the sound of a champagne flute shattering on the floor. It was Cassandra. Her hand, which had been clutching her glass with a white-knuckled intensity, had spasmed, sending crystal and expensive champagne cascading onto the pristine white tablecloth. Her face, moments before alight with a mixture of feigned shame and a certain triumphant defiance, was now a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The trust, the one asset she and Richard had clearly seen as the ultimate prize, the financial bedrock of their planned future together. The one asset over which I, her betrayed fiancé, the man she had just publicly humiliated, held almost absolute, and now clearly very motivated control. Richard, my brother, recovered more quickly, his mind, ever the accountant's, rapidly calculating the new and deeply unfavorable variables in his life's equation. Now, just a minute, Thomas, he began, his voice a little too loud, a little too forceful, a clumsy attempt to regain control of the narrative. The family trust is a shared asset. You can't just make unilateral decisions about it. There are legal protocols. Dad's will, I interrupted, my voice still quiet, almost conversational, a stark contrast to his rising panic, is a document I am intimately familiar with, Richard, as is my solicitor, Mr. Alastair Finch, and as, I am sure, you will become, once your own legal counsel has had a chance to review its rather intricate and, for you, I suspect, deeply inconvenient clauses regarding the duties and discretionary powers of the primary trustee, particularly in circumstances involving a demonstrable moral hazard on the part of another beneficiary. The phrase moral hazard, a term usually reserved for the dispassionate world of insurance and high finance, landed in the emotionally charged atmosphere of the private dining room with the cold, hard impact of a bailiff's gavel. Richard paled visibly. He knew, better than anyone, that his own business dealings, his own financial history, would not stand up to any serious scrutiny regarding moral hazard. And as for my fiancée, Cassandra, I continued, my gaze now shifting to her, my voice taking on a new, icy edge, her connection to the Albright family, and by extension, to any future potential, and I must now stress, entirely hypothetical, benefits from its trust, was contingent on her impending marriage to me. A marriage which, as of this moment, is, I believe the appropriate legal term, is irrevocably terminated. The engagement is off. The wedding is canceled. All deposits, I'm afraid, are forfeit. Cassandra let out a small, wounded sound, a whimper of pure, thwarted avarice. The destination wedding in Tuscany, the designer gown, the lavish multi-day celebration she had been planning with such glee, all funded by anticipated access to my wealth, had just evaporated in a puff of legal smoke. But what about us?" she stammered, looking wildly at Richard, her eyes pleading for him to fix this, to salvage their shared, glittering future. "What about our plans?" Richard, however, was no longer looking at her. He was staring at me, his eyes filled not with passion, not with defiance, but with a dawning, horrified comprehension of the full, catastrophic extent of his miscalculation. He had thought he was executing a simple, if ruthless, personal coup, swapping out a quiet, predictable fiancé, as he likely saw Cassandra at a roll with me, for a more exciting one, while simultaneously positioning himself to finally wrest control of the family fortune from his boring older brother. He had never imagined that his boring older brother, the quiet architect, had not only anticipated his move, but had prepared a countermove of such devastating, multi-layered, strategic elegance. He had not just lost the trust fund. He was now facing the very real and very immediate prospect of a full-scale forensic audit of his own, deeply precarious business empire. "Your plans, Cassandra," I said, my voice now devoid of any emotion whatsoever, are I'm afraid, a matter of complete and utter indifference to me. My only remaining concern, as it pertains to you, is the swift and uncomplicated return of several rather valuable items of my personal property that are currently in your possession, including a pair of antique sapphire cufflinks that belonged to my grandfather and a rather expensive, limited edition timepiece I believe I gave you for your last birthday. I then turned my attention back to Richard, the true architect of this betrayal. Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial tone. You and I will be having a separate conversation. Tomorrow morning, in my solicitor's office, you will come alone, and you will bring with you a full and transparent accounting of every transaction your firm has handled for the last 5 years. Every client file, every investment prospectus, every offshore shell corporation, everything. His eyes widened in terror. You can't, you have no right. Oh, I believe I do, Richard, I replied, allowing a small, cold smile to touch my lips. As a primary beneficiary of the Albright Family Trust, a trust whose assets I have reason to believe may have been indirectly impacted by some of your more creative accounting practices, I have every right to demand a full and transparent audit. It's called due diligence, a concept with which you, as an accountant, should be intimately familiar. I then reached into my pocket and placed a small, simple business card on the table in front of him. It was not my architectural firm's card. It was the card of Eleanor Sterling, the city's most feared and most effective forensic accountant. Ms. Sterling, I said, is a colleague of my solicitor. She specializes in identifying structural weaknesses in complex financial edifices. She is very, very good at her job. I suggest you cooperate with her fully. It will be less painful for you in the long run. The dinner party, my 40th birthday celebration, was now in ruins. My friends, my partners, sat in stunned, uncomfortable silence. The restaurant staff hovered nervously at the periphery, unsure how to handle this unprecedented implosion of upper-class decorum. Richard stared at Eleanor Sterling's business card as if it were his own death warrant. Cassandra was openly sobbing, a harsh, ugly sound that held no trace of her earlier, performative grace. I looked at the wreckage of my own personal life, at the shattered remnants of my engagement, at the raw, gaping wound of my brother's betrayal. And I felt not triumph, not joy, not even the grim satisfaction of revenge. I simply felt a profound, weary, and entirely necessary sense of closure. The structural analysis was complete. The foundational flaws had been identified, and the controlled demolition was proceeding precisely as planned. The new beginning Richard had so smugly toasted was indeed at hand, but the future heralded was one of quiet, meticulous, and entirely legal deconstruction. And I, the quiet architect, would be overseeing every last, damning detail. The meeting in Alastair Finch's office the following morning was a study in contrasts. I was calm, focused, my mind clear, my objectives precise. Richard, on the other hand, was a wreck. He arrived looking haggard, his usually impeccable suit rumpled, his face pale and drawn, the confident, predatory swagger of the previous night replaced by the shuffling, anxious gait of a man facing a firing squad. He was alone. Cassandra, it seemed, had already been deemed a liability, a loose cannon in this new, and for him, terrifyingly high-stakes negotiation. Alastair, my solicitor, presided over the meeting with his usual cool, professional detachment, his presence a silent, authoritative counterpoint to the raw, almost palpable, fear radiating from my brother. Eleanor Sterling, the forensic accountant, was also present, a quiet, sharp-eyed woman whose very presence seemed to make Richard visibly shrink in his chair. We didn't begin with accusations or with threats. I had instructed Alastair and Eleanor to start with a simple, dispassionate presentation of facts. Eleanor, with a calm, almost academic precision, began to walk Richard through the preliminary findings of her analysis of his firm's accounts, an analysis based on the public records and discreet inquiries she had already undertaken as part of my initial due diligence into his business practices. She spoke of over-leveraged property deals, of questionable offshore entities, of a pattern of borrowing from one speculative venture to cover the losses of another. She didn't use the word fraud, not yet. She used the more polite, but no less damning, language of significant financial irregularities, of questionable accounting methodologies, of a potential exposure to both civil and criminal liability. With each new revelation, each carefully presented piece of evidence, Richard seemed to sink further into his chair, the color draining from his face, his earlier, feeble attempts at bluster replaced by a stricken, horrified silence. The architect of his own downfall was being presented with a detailed, irrefutable blueprint of his own impending ruin. Then I spoke, my voice quiet but firm. "Richard," I began, "I did not initiate this investigation out of malice, or a desire for revenge, however justified that might be. I began it months ago, after a deeply unsettling incident involving a potential leak of proprietary information from my own firm, a leak that, I now have reason to believe, originated with you and was intended to benefit one of your less scrupulous business associates." His head snapped up at that, his eyes wide with a new, fresh wave of terror. This was an angle he clearly hadn't anticipated. "The foundation designs for the downtown tower project, Richard," I continued, my voice still even. "Information that was confidential, proprietary, and which, if it had been successfully exploited by our competitors, could have cost my firm, and me personally, millions. Fortunately, the attempt was unsuccessful. But the breach, the betrayal of trust, was significant. I let that hang in the air for a moment. Your affair with Cassandra," I went on, "while personally devastating, is, in the grand scheme of things, a secondary matter. A symptom of a deeper, more profound pathology on your part. A pathology of greed, of entitlement, of a reckless disregard for the consequences of your actions, both personal and professional. My primary concern now is not my broken heart, Richard. It is the preservation of the Albright family trust, a legacy our grandfather and father worked a lifetime to build, a legacy you have treated as your own personal slush fund, a legacy you are clearly prepared to plunder to fund your increasingly desperate and fraudulent schemes." He started to protest, to deny, but I held up a hand. "Do not insult my intelligence by attempting to lie to me, Richard. Not now. Not here. Eleanor's preliminary report is just the tip of the iceberg, and we both know it. A full forensic audit, the kind of financial authorities would conduct, would undoubtedly uncover a great deal more." I then slid a single, thick envelope across the table towards him. "This," I said, "is my proposal. It is not a negotiation. It is a set of non-negotiable terms for a controlled demolition of your current circumstances and a potential, if significantly more modest, reconstruction of your future." He opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The terms were simple and, from his perspective, brutal. He would, effective immediately, resign his position as trustee of the Albright Family Trust, ceding all control and future benefits to me. He would agree to a full, voluntary forensic audit of his own firm's accounts by Eleanor Sterling, and would cooperate fully in a process of orderly liquidation of its assets to repay his numerous creditors, both institutional and private. He would make a formal, written apology to me, to my partners at my architectural firm for the attempted theft of our intellectual property, and to our family for the profound damage his actions had caused. And finally, he would agree to never again have any direct, unsolicited contact with me, or with Cassandra, whose own, separate, and, I was sure, equally unpleasant, settlement negotiations would be handled by Alistair. In return, I would do two things. First, I would agree not to pursue private legal action against him for the attempted corporate espionage. And second, and far more significantly, the dossier on his fraudulent activities, the one that could so easily find its way to the Serious Fraud Office, would remain for now, securely and privately in my possession, a permanent, unspoken guarantee of his future good behavior. He read the document, his face ashen, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. It was a complete and utter surrender. The end of his career, his reputation, his entire carefully constructed world. But it was also, as he must have known, a lifeline, a way to avoid public disgrace, financial ruin, and the very real possibility of a prison sentence. The silence in the room stretched for a long, agonizing minute. Then, with a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of profound, abject defeat, he picked up the pen that lay on the table before him and signed. The architect, the builder, the man who understood the critical importance of solid foundations, had just successfully, and with a quiet, devastating precision, condemned and demolished the corrupt, unstable edifice of his own brother's life. And in its place, there was now a clean, clear, and entirely unencumbered site upon which I could, at last, begin to build my own future, free from the shadows of his betrayal. The unraveling of Richard's life, and by extension, Cassandra's, was as swift as it was, from my detached perspective, remarkably efficient. The signed agreement, legally binding and ironclad, gave Eleanor Sterling and her team of forensic accountants full access to the labyrinthine and deeply fraudulent financial structures Richard had built. The process of liquidation was, as Eleanor later described it, like dissecting a particularly complex and venomous creature. Every layer revealed a new and more unpleasant truth. There were hidden debts, illegal offshore accounts, a Ponzi-like scheme of using new investor funds to pay off old, angry creditors. It was a masterpiece of financial desperation, a testament to a man who had been living on borrowed time and borrowed money for years. The Albright Family Trust, now solely under my control, was entirely firewalled from the ensuing implosion. Its assets were preserved, its legacy secured, just as my grandfather had intended. Richard, stripped of his firm, his reputation, and the bulk of his ill-gotten wealth, was forced into a state of ignominious early retirement. He sold his lavish home, downsized to a small, nondescript apartment, and from what I heard, spent his days in a state of quiet, bitter regret. Cassandra, her own settlement with me finalized, a settlement that left her with little more than her personal effects and a rather large legal bill from Marcus Thorne. Quickly and unsurprisingly, abandoned Richard once his financial well had run definitively dry. Their grand passion, it seemed, had a price tag, and Richard could no longer afford it. She, too, faded into a well-deserved obscurity, her dreams of a life of effortless luxury replaced by the more prosaic realities of a job in retail and a significantly reduced social standing. My own life, in the aftermath of my tumultuous 40th birthday, began a process of quiet, steady reconstruction. My architectural firm, freed from the threat of Richard's corporate espionage, flourished. We won the contract for the Downtown Tower project, its innovative foundation design, my design, earning accolades from the engineering community. I threw myself into my work with a renewed passion, finding a clean, honest satisfaction in the logic, the precision, the tangible reality of creating something strong, beautiful, and enduring. The engagement ring I had once given Cassandra, a beautiful antique sapphire that had belonged to my grandmother, was returned, and I sold it, donating the entire, not insignificant, proceeds to a charity that supported victims of financial fraud. It felt like a cleansing, a final, symbolic severing of a tie that had been built on such a foundation of deceit. I didn't date for a long time. The betrayal had been too profound, the wound too deep. But eventually, slowly, I began to heal. I reconnected with old friends, pursued my passions for travel, for art, for the quiet, contemplative beauty of well-designed spaces. And then, a few years later, I met Eleanor. Not Eleanor Sterling, the forensic accountant, but Eleanor Vance, a brilliant, witty, and deeply kind landscape architect I was introduced to at a professional conference. Our connection was not a whirlwind of passion, but a slow, steady, and deeply satisfying meeting of minds, of souls. We shared a love for design, for history, for the quiet, understated beauty of a life well lived. She understood my past, the scars I carried, and she valued me for my quiet strength, my integrity, my meticulous attention to detail, the very qualities Cassandra had so derided. We build a life together, a life based not on grand illusions or materialistic ambitions, but on a foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and a quiet, unshakable trust. The dossier on Richard, the one that held the power to destroy him utterly, remained in my secure, encrypted digital archives, a silent, dormant testament to a battle fought and won. I never had to use it. The threat of its existence had been enough. It served as a quiet reminder that the most effective weapons are often the ones that are never fired, and that the most profound victories are not those won through outright destruction, but through the strategic and ultimately more satisfying application of undeniable and unassailable leverage. My 40th birthday had indeed been a new beginning. It had been the day I had confronted the catastrophic structural failure at the heart of my own life. It had been the day I'd stopped being a passive victim and had become the architect of my own, more resilient future. The old, corrupt edifice had been demolished, and in its place, I had, with the help of good friends, a brilliant legal team, and a renewed sense of my own worth, designed and built a new structure, a new life, a life whose foundations were, at last, entirely and unshakably sound. And that, for an architect, was the most satisfying project completion of all. The years that followed were a testament to the enduring strength of a life rebuilt on solid ground. My architectural firm grew in prestige, taking on projects that were not just profitable, but also creatively and ethically fulfilling. We became known for our innovative, sustainable designs, for our commitment to quality, and for an unwavering integrity that, I like to believe, was a direct reflection of my own hard-won principles. My relationship with Eleanor Vance, the landscape architect, blossomed into a deep and loving partnership, a collaboration in every sense of the word. We often worked together on projects, her intuitive understanding of the natural environment a perfect complement to my own more structured architectural vision. Our home, a modern but warm house we designed and built together, overlooking a quiet, wooded valley, became our sanctuary, a place filled with books, art, and the easy, comfortable silence of two people who truly understood and respected each other. Of Richard and Cassandra, I heard very little. They had become ghosts from a past life, their names occasionally surfacing in the hushed, almost mythical, whispers of old acquaintances, cautionary tales of ambition, betrayal, and spectacular downfall. Richard, for what I could gather, lived a quiet, solitary life, his professional and social worlds having shrunk to a fraction of their former size. Cassandra, after a series of failed attempts to re-establish herself in the city's social scene, had reportedly moved away, her current whereabouts and circumstances a matter of complete indifference to me. The Albright Family Trust, now securely under my stewardship, was managed with a quiet prudence, its assets growing steadily, its purpose now to provide for the future educational needs of my own and Richard's children, should they require it, and to fund a series of philanthropic endeavors in our parents' name, focusing on causes they had genuinely cared about, like education and community arts programs. It was a way of honoring their memory, while simultaneously cleansing the legacy of Richard's and my own father's more questionable financial ambitions. One cool autumn afternoon, many years after my ill-fated 40th birthday dinner, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Richard. His handwriting, once so bold and confident, was now a shaky, almost hesitant scrawl. The letter was not a plea for money, not an attempt at reconciliation, not a rehashing of old grievances. It was, to my astonishment, an apology. A genuine, heartfelt, and deeply remorseful apology. He wrote of his shame, of his regret, of the profound moral and ethical bankruptcy that had led him to betray me and Cassandra in such a devastating way. He wrote of the long, difficult years of self-reflection, of coming to terms with his own failures, his own insecurities, his lifelong, desperate need for our father's approval, a need that had driven him to such destructive lengths. I see now, Thomas, he had written, in a passage that had clearly cost him a great deal to pen, that I was always jealous of you. Not of your money or your success, though I coveted those things. I was jealous of your integrity, your quiet, unshakable sense of self, your ability to find satisfaction in your work, in your passions, without needing the constant validation of others. You were always the stronger man, the better man. I was just the louder one. And I am so deeply sorry for the pain my loudness, my weakness, my greed caused you. He asked for nothing. He expected nothing. He simply, it seemed, needed to say it to put the truth on the record, a final, painful but necessary accounting of his own soul. I read the letter several times, a complex mixture of emotions washing over me. A flicker of the old, familiar anger, a profound sense of sadness for the years we had lost, and finally, a quiet, unexpected sense of peace. The last stubborn piece of the old, damaged structure had finally been addressed, not through legal action, not through financial leverage, but through the simple, unadorned, and immensely powerful force of a genuine apology. I did not reply to his letter immediately, but a few weeks later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, I found myself driving to the small, nondescript apartment building where he now lived. I had no grand plan, no prepared speech. I simply went. He answered the door himself, looking older, grayer, but with a new, quiet humility in his eyes. We stood there for a moment, two brothers, two strangers, two survivors of shared, difficult past. "I got your letter, Richard," I said finally. "Thank you." He simply nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Would you like to come in for a cup of tea, Thomas?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Yes, Richard," I said. "I think I would." It was not a full reconciliation, not an erasure of the past, but it was a new beginning, a quiet, tentative, and entirely unexpected reconstruction built not on the shifting sands of ambition and deceit, but on the hard-won and hopefully more enduring bedrock of truth, remorse, and the fragile, persistent possibility of grace. The architect, at last, had found a foundation upon which a different kind of structure, a different kind of family might be built.